Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Aspire Australia's presentation today on Australian visa options for parents. I hope you are all well and keeping safe. My name is Sarah Gillis and I will be presenting to you today. We are on a mission here at Aspire Australia, a mission to provide you with the correct information so that you and your families can make informed decisions about the best way forward for your family in terms of visa opportunities. And the overwhelming interest we've had in today's webinar indicates to me that reuniting families is top of mind for many migrants, especially since the pandemic has kept many families apart. So today we will be covering some visa options for parents in detail. There will be the opportunity to ask your questions a bit later in the presentation via the chat function. And if I cannot manage to answer all the questions today, I can certainly send responses in a follow-up email. And later in the presentation, we'll also have an offer for you regarding how you can obtain more information about your specific circumstances. So let's get started. Over the past 20 or more years in which I've been working in the migration sector, I've identified 3 key reasons that migrants want to sponsor their parents. The first is that migrants welcome and love the opportunities that Australia has to offer them, and they wish to share that with other family members, including their parents. We have a great way of life, a great environment, a very safe and secure place to live. Second reason is a sad reason where one parent may die and the remaining parent is maybe left alone in the home country, or where there is no one to really care for them, then migrants wish to invite their remaining parent to be with them in Australia. And when migrants have families of their own, having a grandparent nearby to help with the upbringing of the grandchildren is often high on the list. So let's look at what visa options are available, excluding specific categories such as employment and business. We're just going to focus on the categories that are relevant specifically to parents. So we have the tourist visa, the sponsored parent temporary visa, and the parent visa. And we'll look at these one by one. So the tourist visa is a temporary visa. It allows a maximum period of stay of 12 months in any 18-month period. It's cheap and quick to apply for, quick decision usually, but there's no work permission on that visa. So it's a useful visa for a quick trip to visit family, but it has its limitations. It can be a useful tool, however, in a strategy that you may develop for your family to bring your parents to Australia. And we'll have a look at some examples of that later. The sponsored parent temporary, you can consider it's like an extended tourist visa. It's available for a period of either 3 or 5 years and with a maximum of 10 years. There's no balance of family criterion, so any parent who has an Australian resident child is eligible to apply. The price tag is a little bit higher than the tourist visa. It's still fairly quick, 6 to 12 months to get a visa. But one limitation of this visa is that the parent, whilst holding that visa, is not eligible to apply for any permanent residence visa. So it's a great visa for those who do not have the balance of family in Australia, or again, it can be used as a tool in a longer term strategy. Then we have the parent visa, a permanent visa, which requires the parent to have the balance of family in Australia. It can be expensive in the fast track contributory category. Otherwise, it can be slow with processing times of up to 20 to 30 years. Now, I've mentioned balance of family in those two latter categories, let's have a look at what we mean by that. So the balance of family means that the parents have more children in Australia than they have either in overseas in total, or more children in Australia than in any one country where the majority of their children live. So let's have a look at some examples. So if the parents have 3 children, have 2 in Australia and 1 in country A, the majority is in Australia, so the balance of family test is met. Again, with 3 children, but 1 in Australia and 1 in 2 other countries, there's no majority in Australia, so the balance of family test is not met. If there are 4 children, 2 in Australia, 1 in country A and 1 in country B, yes, there's more in it. Well, there's equal number in Australia as there are overseas. 5 children, 2 in Australia and 1 in each of country A, B and C. Because there are more in Australia than there are in any one country, 2 is greater than 1, then the balance of family is met. And similarly, in the example with 6 children, 3 in Australia, 1 in country A, 2 in country B. Country B has the greatest number, 3 is greater than 2, so the balance of family is met. So you can consider your own circumstances and see whether the balance of family is met, which will then determine whether or not the parent visa may be an opportunity for you. So just having a look at those 3 categories again. Tourist, a temporary interim stay. The sponsored parent temporary, up to 10 years stay in Australia. And the parent permanent visa requires the balance of family. Now, because the permanent visa is often the one that is the goal, we will start by looking at this category in more detail. So in the parent category, there are a number of options for you, decisions, in fact, for you to make about which pathway may be suitable for your circumstances. So we have onshore, which means the application is made in Australia, or offshore, which means that the application and the parent are offshore. Within the onshore, we have contributory, which is a fast track process, and we have the standard, which, as I mentioned before, could take 20 to 30 years. And within the contributory, there is a 2-step process to permanent residence, as well as a direct process to permanent residence. And this is all reflected similarly in the offshore category. So let's start by comparing the different options. So offshore versus onshore. Onshore, the visa applicant must hold an appropriate visa. That means they must have a valid visa, and that visa should not have any condition on it that prevents the applicant from making the application. So frequently on a tourist visa, there may be a no further stay condition, and that would prevent the parent from applying onshore for a visa. An onshore applicant must also be aged, which we'll look at in a moment. And the benefit of applying onshore is that the visa applicant will be granted a bridging visa for the entire processing period. So if an applicant is onshore and applies for the standard parent visa, which we know which may take 20 years, they'll have a bridging visa for that entire period. And usually the applicant will need to be onshore at the time of decision. There are a few COVID concessions available at the moment. So I mentioned aged. Let's look at what we mean by aged. So it all relates to the date of birth of the applicant. If you have a mother and father applying together, only one of them needs to meet the aged criterion. So you can see there that the minimum age is 65 and it runs up to 67 years, depending on the date of birth. This is all linked to the Social Security Act, so there could be further changes down the track. So if your parent is aged, then you know that the onshore opportunity is available to them. Now, if we look at offshore, it does not matter where the applicant is at the time of lodgement, but usually they will need to be offshore at the time of grant. Again, there are some COVID concessions. And whilst the applicant is offshore waiting for the visa to be processed, they can apply for a tourist visa to come and visit family members in the meantime. So you can see the benefit of that tourist visa as a tool during that process. Now, once you've decided whether you're going to apply onshore or offshore, there's another choice to apply in the standard or the contributory category. In the standard category, we have those long waiting times of 20 to 30 years. A sponsor is required. There's a smallish assurance of support bond required to be paid. And if an applicant is in the standard category, they can switch to the contributory category at any time. And the contributory category has a shorter processing time of about 4 to 5 years. So an applicant can jump from the standard into the contributory without losing their place in the queue, and they'll be closer to obtaining a decision. A sponsor is also required in the contributory category, but a very large investment, financial investment, is required as part of an assurance of support. So let's look into what an assurance of support is. It is an assurance that the applicant, so the parents, will not claim any social security benefits for the period of the assurance. Now, the period is 2 years when the application is in the standard parent category, or 10 years if it's in the contributory category. And that assurance is backed up by a bond, and that bond would be forfeited if the applicant were to claim any social security benefits. Basically, the bond would be returned to the assurer less any amounts that were claimed on social security. Now, the assurer does not need to be the same person as the sponsor, and there can be one or more assurers. And this is important to note because there is an income threshold to be met. So if one person is unable to provide the assurance themselves, they may join up with another person to jointly provide the assurance. And this is all processed by Centrelink, who have their own tables of information and assessment criteria. And it is an application that is made at the time of decision. So we'll have a look at the costs of an assurance in a moment and when payments are required. But it's good to think in advance who might be the assurer, what is the financial capacity to meet the assurance, and then that will be provided in detail at the time of decision. So time of decision in the standard category is when the decision is made on the application. There's just one application, you apply, you wait your 20 years, they're ready to make a decision. That's when the assurance would be required. In the contributory category, there are 2 opportunities. So the application is lodged, you first obtain a temporary visa, and then within 2 years you obtain the permanent visa or apply for the permanent visa. It's at that point of time, at that permanent stage, that the assurance is required. Or if in the contributory you go directly to permanent, then again, that is when the assurance of support is required. So you can see in this table here the difference between the costs. The first visa application charge is the fee payable when the parent visa application is lodged with the Department of Home Affairs. There's a fee for the main applicant and also any included applicants. And then at the time of decision, the second visa application charge is payable, as is the assurance of support bond. And you can see when I said substantial fee in the contributory category, you're paying $43,660 per adult for the fast track visa instead of $2,000 in the standard category. However, in the standard category, you're waiting 20 years for a visa. In the contributory, you're fast tracking to 4 or 5 years. So there's pros and cons with each category. And here's a tally for a couple, the costs that would be incurred for the visa application fees, the assurance of support bond. So in the standard category, $17,500, and in the contributory category, $106,000. And as I mentioned, these fees will be paid at different points of time. So in the standard category, again, this is a scenario for husband and wife. The application fee there is paid now when you lodge the application, and in 20 to 30 years' time, you'll pay the other fees. In the contributory category, where you go via a temporary process towards the permanent, you'll pay the lodgement fee now. In 4 to 5 years' time, you'll pay the first part of the second visa application charge. And then within another 2 years, you need to pay the balance. So you can see that's more or less split the fees in two. So in the contributory, temporary to permanent, you're basically paying it 5 years and 7 years. Whereas if you go directly to the contributory, you're paying the full amount in 4 to 5 years' time. So if you're thinking of your cash flow, you can work out which option is better for you. So when you're looking at the parent visa pathways, you're looking first of all at eligibility. Is the applicant aged? Does the applicant meet balance of family? Therefore, can I choose onshore or offshore, either or both? Sorry. Then we're looking at your choice of contributory or standard, and then, of course, your capacity to pay. If you've chosen the contributory, do you want to pay the fees all at once or in 2 stages? And with all the parent visas, a sponsor is required. So that sponsor would be the child or stepchild of the parent. And the child must be settled in Australia. So that means they should be lawfully residing in Australia and have lawfully resided in Australia for a reasonable period. Now, department policy says that may be 2 years, but it could certainly be less than that. It will depend very much on the circumstances of the sponsor. The sponsor should be aged at least 18, although there are circumstances where a guardian of a sponsor aged under 18 can stand in the place and sponsor the parents. The sponsor needs to be an Australian citizen, permanent resident, or eligible New Zealand citizen. And the sponsor must be able to meet their sponsorship obligations. And those obligations are to assist the visa applicant or applicants financially and in respect of accommodation for a period of 2 years after the visa is granted. So that was the parent category, which was the permanent residence option. Now let's have a look at the sponsored parent temporary alternative. This also requires a sponsor, and the first items are similar to the parent visa, but there are additional requirements for this category. So sponsors must pass an income test, conduct test, and have no outstanding debts. And we'll have a look at those in detail now. So the income test requires the income of the sponsor or the sponsor's household to be a minimum of $83,454.80 in the most recent financial year. And that income can be contributed by the sponsor and the sponsor's partner, and also any other child of the parent who is being sponsored, who also happens to be an Australian citizen, permanent resident or eligible New Zealand citizen. So basically the sponsor and the sponsor's partner and the sponsor's sibling can contribute their taxable income to meet this threshold. However, the sponsor must meet at least half the income requirement. So from 83,454, let's say the sponsor has a taxable income of 43,000, that's more than half, and the balance can be made up by the partner and or the sibling. The sponsored temporary parent visa has a lot of requirements and a lot of restrictions. And these relate not only to the visa applicant, but also to the sponsor. So the sponsor must pass a good conduct test. And this means that there must be no adverse information about the sponsor or any persons associated with the sponsor. Now, persons associated is very broadly defined and includes the applicant, the spouse, any member of the family unit, any member of a similar social group, common friends, consultant, advisor, employer, employee. It's very, very broad. And adverse information relates to the contravention of a state or a Commonwealth law, the provision of false or misleading information or bogus documents to the department, or where the person is insolvent. So if you imagine you are the sponsor and the network of people that you know or are related to and who may have some adverse information about them, it's a very wide net. Now, the only saving grace is that if there is some information that is adverse, the department can still approve a sponsorship if it's reasonable to disregard that information. So, for example, if you're the sponsor and you have an ex-husband or wife who has gone on to become insolvent or break some state or federal law, it would be likely that it would be reasonable to disregard that information. And the sponsor will need to provide a police clearance certificate for any countries they've lived for at least 12 months cumulatively over the past 10 years. And will also be required to answer questions in the sponsorship application form about adverse information. Now, the lodgement of the sponsorship is also a great opportunity for the government to get any outstanding debts repaid by the sponsor. And that includes health debts that may be payable by the sponsor to a hospital, only incurred since April 2019, or any outstanding debts to the Commonwealth, such as a tax debt. So if you are aware of any debts that you have in either of those sections, you would need to pay them off before applying for sponsorship. Otherwise, the department will certainly do a search and notify you if there are any debts, and there will be an opportunity to pay those off before the sponsorship is decided. Now, there are also some limitations on sponsorship. So especially if you have a husband and wife wishing to each sponsor their parents to Australia, that would be 4 parents. However, there are some limitations. So the sponsor and the partner are considered one unit when it comes to family sponsorship. And that one unit can sponsor no more than 2 parents at any one time. So the wife could sponsor her parents, and once that visa was expired, the husband could sponsor his parents, but no more than 2 at any one time. And even if one partner has applied to be a sponsor and there's no decision on that yet, the other cannot apply simultaneously to become a sponsor. So in that case, the first sponsorship application would need to be withdrawn so that there's only one sponsorship application in the pipeline. So it's important to keep this in mind when looking at an overall strategy for a couple, so a migrant couple who may wish to bring their both sets of parents for maybe the same or different reasons, different lengths of time, but it's important to remember that restriction. In this temporary category, the sponsorship is valid until it's not valid. So it becomes invalid if the visa applicant, so the parent or parents, have not applied within 6 months of the sponsorship approval. So the sponsorship is generally processed quite quickly, could be a matter of just a couple of months. So the visa applicants should really be ready to lodge their application as soon as the sponsorship is approved, so that the sponsorship doesn't become invalid due to delay. If the sponsored parent temporary visa is granted to a parent, but then later ceases after 3 years or 5 years, depending which visa you've applied for or which period of time you've applied for, then once the visa ceases, the sponsorship is also no longer in effect. And if the parent obtains permanent residence, the sponsorship again is not in effect. And if the sponsor dies or the sponsorship is withdrawn, then again, the sponsorship is no longer valid. And that will affect the visa applicant or the visa holder, and we'll look at that effect shortly. Now, in terms of the visa applicant, this is a temporary visa, so there are quite stringent requirements. The first is that the applicant is only allowed to apply offshore unless there are exceptional circumstances that would allow them to apply onshore. For example, if a parent were here on a tourist visa right now and in this sort of COVID situation and can't leave the country safely, then it may be that that would be considered exceptional circumstances to allow them to apply onshore. But if there are no exceptional circumstances, then the applicant must be offshore and must have been out of Australia for at least 90 days. So the applicant could not be on a tourist visa in Australia, leave the country and apply immediately for this visa. They'd need to wait at least 90 days. And again, keeping in mind that the sponsorship's only valid for 6 months, you need to make sure those timeframes are considered. Now, the visa applicant, let's say it's the husband, the father is the main visa applicant. They can include their partner, but they can't include any other dependents. So in the parent permanent visa, the husband and wife can include dependent children, but in this category, no, it's purely for the parents. Now, parents must show they've complied with previous Australian visas, and it doesn't really matter where they are at the time of decision, which is nice. It's a temporary visa, so they must show that they only have genuine temporary intentions in relation to Australia and that they're not intending to apply for permanent residence. Now, where the department can see that maybe the balance of family is in Australia and the applicant may be eligible for the parent visa, the applicant for this sponsored parent temporary visa will have to be quite careful about how they explain their intentions for Australia. They must have funds for the period of stay, health insurance, and themselves have no outstanding health debt to any Commonwealth or state hospital or facility. They must meet health and character criteria. Now, the visa will be valid. As we mentioned before, the visa can be applied for a 3 or 5 year period. It will cease within 35 days if the sponsor withdraws the sponsorship. So if there's been some falling out, then the parent has only 35 days left on their visa unless they can obtain a new sponsor. So it is possible to swap sponsors, but there's only 35 days to do that if the sponsor withdraws. Now, if it's a situation where there's been some falling out, the visa applicant may not know directly, or the visa holder may not know directly that that has happened, but the department will notify the visa applicant. Similarly, if the sponsor dies and no new sponsorship has been lodged, then the visa will expire within 90 days. Now, in that scenario, it would be a very emotional time, but it's necessary for someone else to step in and sponsor the parent, if possible, during those 90 days. Otherwise, the parent's visa will cease and they will be required to leave Australia. Now, once the visa is granted, there are a number of conditions. So no salary without permission. So the parents can certainly undertake volunteer work, but work generally is not permitted. Maintain health insurance. Another important one, must not remain in Australia after the visa expires. Now that's what we would usually expect of any visa, that the visa holder leaves Australia before the visa expires. However, in this case, if the parent has obtained, say, a 5-year visa and then wants to apply for another 5-year visa, but stays in Australia on a tourist visa or something like that, they will have breached this condition, and that may prevent them from gaining a further sponsored parent visa. So it's important that the parent departs Australia within that period. And there are very strict notification of change of circumstances requirements. So if the applicant or the visa holder changes name, address, phone, email, online profile, a username in any online service, so they are very strict, and the department clearly wants to know where the visa holder is at all times. So we've looked in detail at these two categories: the sponsored temporary visa. 1 or 2 parents can come for a 3 or 5 year period and may be extended up to a maximum of 10 years. They only need 1 child who's an Australian citizen or resident to be in Australia to sponsor them. There's a lodgement fee, a mid-level fee, and whilst holding the sponsored temporary visa, that parent cannot apply for a permanent residence visa. So you would apply for that category if there's no balance of family, or in a longer term strategy to maybe move towards the parent visa, especially if you're looking at a contributory category visa, and you might want to give yourself time to save up the money. So we can also look at the financial differences between these categories in terms of the lodgement fees, the assurance of support bond. You can also see the number of visas available. So in the parent visa category in this financial year, there were 4,500 visas available, as opposed to 15,000 in the sponsored temporary. Now, due to COVID, there will not have been that many granted, and certainly no temporary entrants permitted to come into Australia. But this is indicative of the government's intentions to allow these sponsored temporary parents great latitude to come to Australia. Processing time, again, from 30 years down to, for the sponsored temporary, it's maybe 6 to 12 months. And if we look also at the price tags on these, you can see the difference there as well. So the sponsored temporary coming in cheaply, and the contributory being more than 10 times, but the advantages being to get a visa in maybe 4 to 5 years or up to 6 years. So with all these choices and criteria, it's necessary to think about your strategy and build it from the ground up, keeping in mind what are the short and long-term goals. Now, with COVID, we're not having tourists enter Australia, so those short-term goals may not be there at the moment. and it may be that you're looking more at the long term, but you need to think of all the goals and prioritise them, which is most important, because whilst the categories might be quite straightforward, the strategy can be quite confusing, and there can be often a number of options. Timeframes. When do you want the parents in Australia? For how long? Look at the eligibility. Are you as the sponsor or you as the visa applicant eligible right now or not? If, for example, a parent has 3 children, 1 is in Australia, 2 in the home country, but 1 is applying to migrate, maybe that balance of family may be met at some point of time and change your choices. So looking at eligibility now, but also down the track. Also financial capacity to meet the application fees, the contributory, looking at the time frames and the cash flow, where we looked at when the fees would be payable, and also health. So whilst the standard category may be a good one to apply, especially if the applicant is onshore, you have to think about the applicant's health as well. If there is any health issue or it's likely to deteriorate, then waiting 20 to 30 years and then getting a refusal is not such a good idea. So keeping all those in mind. Now, here are a few examples of some applications that we have done recently, just to give you an idea of what's possible. So Virginia wanted to reunite with her son, who was already in Australia as a permanent resident. And she had a daughter who was almost 18. And one of the issues was that if the daughter turned 18 and was no longer dependent, then she couldn't be included in the visa application. So it was important to get things moving quite quickly. The solution was to apply for the offshore contributory temporary visa. In the meantime, Virginia and her daughter could come to Australia as tourists. And then once the contributory temporary visa was granted, they came on shore and within 2 years paid the balance of the fee. The daughter was still dependent at that time by staying in full-time study and was able to obtain the permanent visa with her mother. Another story of a family who wanted to obtain permanent residence for the parents as quickly as possible. Now, an offshore standard parent visa had been lodged some time back, but luckily, just prior to COVID, the parents were in Australia on tourist visas. So the onshore the choice was between now lodging an onshore standard category visa, wait the 20 to 30 years, or convert the offshore parent into a contributory category. And that was going to be the quickest way to get a permanent residence outcome, and that was the decision made. Now, because the offshore parent had been lodged 5 years ago, when we switched to the contributory category, the application was at the top of the queue and was available for immediate processing. And even though the visa application was an offshore, because of the COVID concession, the parent is permitted to obtain the visa while still in Australia and is now queued for visa grant from 1st of July. Another scenario, Australian permanent resident son and his family invite the parents to come to Australia on a tourist visa from Malaysia. They come, COVID happens, the son doesn't want the parents to return home, nor do the parents necessarily want to return home. But the tourist visa had a no further stay condition on it. So the first thing to do was to have that no further stay condition waived on the basis that the visa applicants, it was not safe for them to go back to their country. Once that condition was waived, we were able to lodge an onshore parent visa in the standard category. The visa applicants have been given bridging visas to remain in Australia for the entire processing time. and later it can be converted to a contributory category when the funds are available. We would love to be your migration superhero as well. So following this webinar, we will be sending you an offer for a $50 discount on a one-on-one consultation with me, where we can have a look at your specific circumstances and what you and your family are trying to achieve, and come up with a strategy that will help you and your family reunite in Australia. Now, you should be able to add any questions in the chat function by now if you'd like to. So if you have some questions, please feel free. So I'm just going to have a look there. So a question here, can I bring my parents and my in-laws in the permanent visa if they all match the criteria? So Eduardo, if you're looking at the parent permanent visa, then you and your partner can each bring your both sets of parents to Australia, yes. It's only in the parent temporary category where only two parents can be sponsored at any one time. So if you look at the permanent residence category, all four parents can be sponsored straight away. So a message here from, let me have a look. So Jugal, one parent, one child in Australia, one child in the US, parents in India, meet the balance of family test? Yes, because there are equal numbers of children in Australia as there are overseas, so the balance of family test would be met. So Vaishali, your mother has a tourist visa and presumably is in Australia, expiring in October. Oh no, she's currently in the US. And as the borders are currently closed, no one will be allowed in unless there are compelling or compassionate reasons. So even though your mother has the tourist visa, it won't permit her entry to Australia at the moment. There will be depending when she applied for the visa, she can either, if there are compelling reasons, apply for a travel exemption. If there are no compelling reasons, then when the border reopens, she can apply again for a further tourist visa, and it may be a fee-free application. But given that she was granted a tourist visa before, I'm pretty sure she would be granted a tourist visa again. And then depending on other scenarios, you can look at what other visas she may apply for. I think once the borders reopen, there will be a flood of applications for tourist visas, so expect a bit of a waiting time at that point. So Brenda, can the 10-year temporary visa be extended a year before the expiry? So the visa is available for a maximum of 10 years. So if an applicant has first got the visa for, say, 5 years, yes, at any point of time in that 5 years, you can apply for a further temporary visa, remembering that the applicant needs to be offshore unless there are exceptional reasons. But you don't need to wait till the last minute if that was the point of your question. So Radhika has a question about parent health issues. So the health requirement is that the visa applicant does not have any condition which is either contagious or would be costly to the Australian community in terms of health services. So I can't provide advice about medical matters. So if it's a question, whatever the health situation, it requires an analysis of what is the health situation now and what is the situation going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. Now, depending on the age of the visa applicant, if the parent is older, they may only have to show health costs for a period of 10 years. If the applicant is younger, then the life expectancy is longer, so the health cost is over that longer period. The dollar barrier is quite low, so and the cost of health service is quite high, so that the health criterion is actually quite difficult to meet if there are ongoing requirements. And also in relation to health, it's not what the applicant actually uses, but it's what the applicant could hypothetically need in the future. So even if you're sponsoring your parent and you say, we're going to look after them at home and we've got the funds to do that and we'll pay for the doctors, we'll pay for the medication. Hypothetically, if that person is eligible for certain services, then that is the cost that's going to be attributed. So it's not possible to necessarily have that health cost in advance, but certainly looking at the prognosis over the period. So your parent would get a prognosis from their doctor over the period and see what those health costs may be in Australia. So Venkat says that he's in Australia and has 2 siblings in India. So that is not, the balance of family is not yet met. So Venkat, you could bring your mother on the temporary sponsored parent visa for 3 or 5 years, extendable for up to 10 years. If one child is in Australia, second child is in US, balance of family met. Yes. So mother born for Virginia, mother born in January 57. I just don't have the table in front of me, but yes, only once the person is aged could they apply onshore for the parent visa. But regardless of age, a parent who meets the balance of family test can apply offshore. So the aged requirement is only for the applicant onshore. So it depends how long there is to wait. 67, so what's that? Is that 2024? So it's weighing up waiting until then, hoping to get the tourist visa without a restrictive condition to come to Australia, and then applying onshore, or just biting the bullet and applying offshore straight away. So you need to talk through those options. Thanks, Balaji. The recording is going to be available. We'll upload to YouTube and send you the link. Vic Gambier would like to know our fees. Well, we'll need to know what we're going to do for you. So feel free to take advantage of our discounted consultation, and we can run through the options and then provide you with a quotation. So Vaishali asks about the sponsored parent visa. No one will get through the borders right now unless there are compelling reasons. So you can apply for the visa and have the visa granted in the temporary category, but until the borders are reopened, the person will not be able to enter Australia. So Neha asks about eligibility for Medicare when a parent is on the bridging visa. No Medicare, and will need their own health insurance if they desire. Vic Gambier also asks, once the parent gets PR, they're entitled to the same benefits as any other permanent residents. They will not be eligible for some social security benefits, and that's the purpose of the assurance of support bond. And also pensions, they will not be eligible for a pension for a period of 10 years. But in terms of once they're a PR, getting Medicare, being able to purchase property, employment, any other benefits of a permanent resident, yes, it is just reduced social security benefits at that time. Travel exemption on a tourist visa, there needs to be compelling or compassionate reasons for the visa applicant to come to Australia. So it could be because of the health of a family member in Australia, but they'll be granted on very limited circumstances, and Vaishali, happy to talk to you about that. So Renee has asked about a Commonwealth supported student debt. Renee, I'd have to take that one on advisement. I'm not quite sure about that. I'm not sure if you mean a HEX debt. I don't think that applies, but maybe you can contact me and provide me with a bit more detail. So Jay Teixeira, can parents leave their country if they're granted the 5-year sponsored temporary parent visa? Yes, they'll have a visa for 5 years that will have multiple travel facility. Thank you for all your comments. So we will be sending the link to the webinar and the offer to you in the coming days. And yes, happy to meet with you and answer any additional questions. Let's wait to see if there are any more questions. Agnello. So mother's got a tourist visa but stuck in India. Again, you'll need to wait till the borders open unless there are any compelling reasons for the mother to travel. But if you wish to apply for a parent visa or the sponsored temporary parent visa in the meantime, you know, you can use this time wisely so that once the borders open, your mother can come. I mean, as you say, she already has the tourist visa, but if you're looking at other options, you may wish to do that as well. Otherwise, you will need to wait till the borders reopen at some indeterminate time in the future. So thank you everyone for coming today. I hope I didn't rush through that too much, but please review the recording and you can stop it at any time to get the information you need. Otherwise, be in touch with me and I'll look forward to helping you. So just a final question. Are they approving tourist visas with the borders closed? Generally speaking, one needs to lodge the tourist visa application and a travel exemption, and if the travel exemption is not granted, the tourist visa may still be granted, so it could go either way. All right, well, look, thanks again, everyone, and I wish you all a good and safe day, and yeah, please be in touch with any further questions. Thank you. Bye.